The Silk Road. Ancient, exotic, romantic. Central Asia is a long way away from my middle school classroom, where I first heard the phrase Silk Road. Back then, it was the stuff of fairy tales, storybooks, and 1,001 Nights. The story was that the riches of China flowed along its paths. Ivory, jade, tea, porcelain, and silk. This led to incredible wealth for the middlemen along the way that the caravans traveled. Uzbekistan became a central hub of the trade and developed an architecture that bedazzles. Mosaics that astonish. And art that enchants. The Silk Road was actually a number of roads, a network of goods making their way east and west towards markets that found them exotic, and whose markets seemed to have an endless appetite for the products from far away. Today, we travel to Uzbekistan, located in the stands of the old USSR, seen here on the left in pink. My photographer husband and I spent 3 weeks in Uzbekistan, thrilled with the many facets of their culture that we observed. Handcrafted bread, baked in brick ovens. Savory and sweets in the open-air markets. Exotic fruit, fresh or dried. And oh, the pungent spices. People that are warm and welcoming. Open a door here, and you will find guest culture. The custom of seeing a stranger that enters a household as a gift from God Himself. But let's stop at that door for a moment. A side comment here about Uzbek doors. Oh my. The thrill of old wood. The skill of the carver. The beauty of the handmade. You will see many Uzbek door handles in this presentation. I will use them as a pause button at various moments in the talk. But back to the narrative. The detail that stunned me most in Uzbekistan was the reason for the ancient success of the trade routes, the silk. This exotic cloth, originally made in China, was in great demand in the Roman Empire. We've all seen the marble statues, the incredibly draped togas. A whole lot of silk traveled through Central Asia to feed the demand in Rome. Silk, yes. And for me, this was a personal pilgrimage to the Uzbek Ikat. For those of you who haven't discovered this yet, this secret of the weaving world, Ikat is a way of producing patterned cloth not by printing the design on once the cloth has been woven, no, but rather by encoding the pattern into the very threads while they are still threads, before they ever approach a loom. This is Ikat. And it is everywhere in Uzbekistan. It's the national dress. You can see it in silk for dress-up occasions, in cotton for everyday use, and in Ikat velvet, because plain weave Ikat is not complex enough, it seems. The casual, unknowing observer will see the pleasant patterns, acknowledge them as lovely, and possibly think no more about them than to say, hey, that's pretty cloth. But the process of making these patterns appear, the saga, if you will, of making this cloth is an odyssey, well worth seeing. So I invite you to join me on this journey to see this cloth being pulled into being. The artisans who design, who reel the silk, tie the patterns, color it in vibrant hues, and those who weave the threads into cloth are all to be applauded. The cloth itself to be marveled at. I have breather slides in this presentation when our minds have been boggled enough, or when we need just a moment to absorb what it is that we're seeing. We'll get a nice slide of Uzbek door rings and gather ourselves again. Are we ready for the saga to begin? Let's look at the finished cloth before we start. Ikat's characteristic fuzzy edges in the color fields are the hallmark of the cloth and are very desirable. It shows the cloth to be handcrafted, not just a design printed on broadcloth. This is a close-up of that Ikat. The way to tell true thread Ikat is to look at the border between two color fields and to notice that the color changes actually happen at the width of one single thread. Another tip is that both sides have the same intensity of color since the thread is dyed, not the surface of the finished cloth. It will help you understand this process if we think of the warp threads as a number of individual slices. My husband sliced up this picture for me and has given you the different sections. These slices are usually 28 threads wide, and the Uzbek name for the slice is a lipid. Ikat is done in cotton as well, but in this presentation, we'll be looking at silk. And silk begins with mulberry. As you probably know, to grow the Mori bombyx silk moth, you need mulberry leaves. These caterpillars are incredibly picky and will eat nothing else. The center of one of the workshops we visited had this mulberry tree in the courtyard, and they said it was planted there around 1880. To produce a lot of silk, a country needs a lot of mulberry leaves. We watched a whole lot of highway go by in Uzbekistan, with mulberry trees planted along the shoulders. These are somewhat stunted in their growth because so often the leaves will be harvested for the many hungry caterpillars. Don't worry, the trees will recover. Young caterpillars will be coddled by their human servants with fresh leaves every morning, pampered until they're mature enough to spin cocoons for the final phase of their life cycle. Uzbekistan produces a lot of silk cocoons. Reeling silk from the cocoons involves carefully unwinding them, allowing the entire length of filament to remain intact and unbroken. Do you have any idea how long a silkworm filament is when you unwind it in one piece? About a mile. A large number of cocoons are allowed to tumble in warm water as their incredibly thin strands are pulled together into a more usable, more robust thickness. The workshop had a demonstrator to show us how it was done in the olden days. So that strand is a number of silkworm filaments that are now going to be a thread for weaving. Look at that luster. This, of course, is good as a demonstration and interesting as a historical note. And although some people do still reel this way for small production, this method is far too slow for the hungry looms of Uzbekistan. If you're going for production volumes, you need to find a faster way. This is a silk reeling factory where the ladies tend to the tumbling cocoons in the warm water baths in front of them, watching and replacing new cocoons as the older ones run out of filament, always feeding the delicate strand that travels up and over their heads and onto the swifts. Raw silk is beige in color and needs to be cleaned to have the sericin removed. That's called worm spit, by the way. It's removed with strong soap, and then the silk is white. Mordanting the fiber is the next step. to allow the upcoming dyes to better adhere to the strands. Wood fire for heat, and human hands at every step. Now we're ready to think about winding a warp. Now, as we start into this Ikat odyssey, it's interesting to note that each step is done by a separate family in their own courtyard. The silk travels from household to household into the hands of specialized craftspeople who really know their stuff. The hanks are wound onto large bobbins and onto the biggest warping mill I've ever seen in my life. And this is how you start out the round and tension the warp. And here's the high-tech solution for getting the mill to break as it rotates. That's a metal plate with a stone on it. Isn't that beautiful? Once wound, the warp gets chained up into a white garbage bag. This warp is 300 meters long, I asked. I said to the director, "Oh, well, why stop at 300 meters?" And he took my question seriously. He said, "Oh, well, after 300 meters, the pattern starts to shift." Now, keep an eye on that white garbage bag that the chain is falling into there. We're going to see it again. Here's our white plastic garbage bag at the house of the next family, the family that does the next step. Here, the artisans will separate out the 300 meters of white chain into 100 hanks that are 2-meter loops. The blue frame you see is a support for the 2 stainless steel pipes that are exactly 2 meters apart from one another. Now, all of this will make sense in about 7 minutes, trust me. Each of the lipid sections are threaded through that wooden spacing stick that you see, which has a hole drilled evenly along its length. The silk is attached to the first pole, and we begin the method of winding the lipids. Everything's kept wet with water. And the 2-meter length is pulled. That's the spacing stick that separates the chain into the 100 lipids. One man is in charge of making sure that each strand lands on the lipid it's intended for. And the other fellow needs to be the athletic one. He's the one that carries the white bag of silk along the path that it needs to go, with the first guy's spacing stick following his every move for 300 meters. Round and round and round it goes, making 100 identical lipid hanks, all lined up on top of each other. And when it's finished, it's important to have all the ends available and obvious. Now, this is the point where the sket is put in. The sket is the point where the white threads are bound together tightly to offer a resist to the coming colors. This single point will stay white all the way to the finished cloth and will be the anchor point that the entire pattern will be gauged from. Here's a quick jump into the future to show you what a sket looks like in the finished warp. The ideal sket in finished cloth is fine and straight. When purchasing Ikat cloth, you can judge the quality of the work by how straight and pure the sket line is. I've seen the sket line used and shown proudly